Hey, all you cool cats and kittens, it's your favorite history teacher back at you again with another historical video. And today's kind of a big lecture because it is the discussion of the foundation of our country, the beginnings, the Constitution, and what happens afterwards. So buckle up because a lot of juicy information comes from this time period, especially obviously the Constitution. So let's get into it. Let's get into it right now. Chapter 6, we are moving right along, and we are, chugging along. Okay, it's present mode. All right. Chapter 6, the Constitution and the New Republic. The Constitution and the New Republic. Quite a lot. I guess you could say this was a fairly long chapter, so that just probably means there's going to be a lot of writing for notes. Because like I said, a lot of stuff is coming up. Okay, so framing a new government. Remember, it wasn't that the Constitution founds America, after the Declaration, or after the American Revolution and the signing of the Treaty of Paris, which ends the Revolutionary War. Okay. Now, what does America do? America creates, the Articles of Confederation. That was the first Constitution, remember. But the Articles also had a lot of problems. And one of those was a weak central government. So many Americans wanted this stronger sense of central government. So you have this Newburgh conspiracy where former Revolutionary War veterans were upset about not receiving their pensions. And, remember, the colonial government during the Revolutionary War didn't have that much money to spend. So George Washington steps in to prevent a rebellion on their hands. Remember, a major weakness of the Articles is the lack of their ability to tax. And, the colonists now beginning Americans, they didn't want to be taxed. So that's why the Articles didn't really tax. But at the same time, that weakened the central government. So you have the Annapolis Convention, Annapolis, whichever way you want to say it. 1786, and 5 states showed up to discuss the idea of commerce, interstate commerce, trade between each state. And it was kind of a failure, but the one bright spot was Alexander Hamilton gains a promise to meet the following year in Philadelphia to revise the Articles of Confederation. And that will be called the Constitutional Convention. And remember, Shays' Rebellion also helped people demand a strong central government because Daniel Shays was able to do what he wanted to because there wasn't a national army to put down his rebellion right away. So here you got Alexander Hamilton and George Washington, Hammy and Washi. All right, sorry. This is the big idea. I'm sorry. You have to write a lot. I'm sorry. Okay, it is what it is. All right, Constitutional Convention. They were only going to revise the Articles, and they said, "To heck with it. We need to start over." So 55 delegates from 12 states, except for Rhode Island, because Rhode Island is the smallest state, and they had representation issues. Key players at the Constitutional Convention, obviously George Washington, he was the president of the convention. And you got a guy lesser known in American history, Edmund Randolph from Virginia, who proposed the 3 branches of government idea, who he got from world history people, Baron de Montesquieu, you are correct if you said separation of powers. Okay, so the obvious issue is representation, because remember, if they wanted to amend the Articles of Confederation, you had to have 100%, all 13 states had to approve these amendments, and if one state vetoed it, then it fell apart. Okay, so this issue of representation. So you kind of need to know these plans and which kind of states based on population associated themselves with which plan. So the first plan brought forth by James Madison, the Virginia plan, was a bicameral, meaning two-house legislature based upon representation and population. So the bigger states, the more population, the more representation you get in the legislature. The New Jersey plan brought forth by William Patterson, he wanted to propose a unicameral, one house legislature with each state having equal representation, kind of like what has already been done under the Articles. And each state gets equal representation, no matter the size, no matter the amount of people living in the state. But then that obviously those are at two different ends of the spectrum. So you have something called the Great Compromise, and that was brought forth by Roger Sherman, and he was from Connecticut. It's also called the Connecticut Compromise if you want to get into it that way. Look at that. I already have it there. I know what I'm talking about. So he compromised with both plans to create a bicameral legislature. The lower house, House of Representatives, will be based on population. And you have the upper house, the Senate, which would have 2 representatives per state. And also, it's a good thing to note that senators were elected by state legislatures, not by popular vote. It isn't until the 17th Amendment, way down the line, that that people elect their senators. So state legislatures would elect their own people to be put into the Senate. So I'm not going to say that's kind of corrupt, but you could argue that there's going to be some, should he be a senator? Should he not be a senator? All that. Okay. So here's our boy, William. Is it William? Edmund. This is Edmund Randolph. And then this is the kind of the synopsis of the Virginia plan, and which would depend on population. The New Jersey plan, unicameral, received 1 vote. Both plans wanted a national government with 3 branches. So Great Compromise, House of Reps, and the Senate, which both sides win. And the agreement to both houses of Congress must pass every law. So it's literally a win-win-win-win. All right, some other compromises you should know around this time period with the Constitution coming into play. You have the 3/5 compromise, because obviously Southern states have slaves, and the idea, if all men are created equal but slaves are not, but slaves are men, how do we account for slaves? Because Southern states are more rural, right? And there's not a lot of people living down south. So they want to have slaves count towards population to give them equal representation in the House. So one way around that is the 3/5 compromise. So slaves would count towards 3/5 of a person when determining a population in the House, not like you cut a person into fifths and 3/5 of that equals. Just think of it as if there are 100, if you own 100 slaves, they will count towards 60 people. I think I did my math right. You also have the slave trade compromise, where slave importation could not be stopped prior to 1808. So after 1808, no more international slave trade. So Congress is the Constitution is kind of setting up this idea of slavery and what's to happen. So you also have the Commerce Compromise, where Congress decided whether or not to have taxes on exports and imports. They chose imports. Obviously, those are tariffs. So you have sovereignty. This idea, you're going to hear it later on, and called popular sovereignty, where that much later down the line is dependent upon whether the new states will have slavery or not. But in this idea of sovereignty, where does it lie? Who has the ultimate power, right? And James Madison said, the people have the ultimate power. So you have the Supremacy Clause, which the Constitution would now be the supreme law of the land. And you also have the Necessary and Proper Clause, also called elastic, where Congress could make laws that are necessary and proper for the country. So that's rubber bands, elastic. All right, again, bigger ideas, people, bigger ideas. So you have two types of groups of thought. You have the Federalists, who are those men, those representatives, those in government, those people who favored a strong central government, and they'd like the Constitution as it was written. You have the Anti-Federalists, who are those who favored a weaker central government and were weary of the Constitution. Okay, and they were, I'm not going to say that they weren't for the Constitution. They just wanted some, they wanted some ideas and rights passed before they would agree to it, because everyone agreed that, yes, we need a strong central government. We need a type of central government that's better than the Articles of Confederation. So you have what is then known as the Federalist Papers, which are a bunch of essays, that are published under false, I guess you could just say under fake names, right? And they're mainly written by three men: Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. And their purpose was to gain support for the ratification of the Constitution. So publishing in anti-Federalist supporters newspapers, and just publishing all across the 13 states that we need to get this thing ratified. Okay, this happened, the Constitutional Convention, I believe, happened in 1788. I want to say, sorry, I'm going backwards. 1787 was the Constitutional Convention. Okay, 1787. It wasn't until about 1791 that they decided that there needed to be a Bill of Rights, and that was the Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists said, sure, yeah, we will agree to the Constitution if you give us a Bill of Rights. And they added to the Constitution, and it was ratified 1791. So Federalists promised to add them to gain support of the Anti-Federalists. That's why the Constitution was passed. And then you get George Washington was unanimously elected president and was inaugurated April 30th, 1789. So that's when the first president is. All right. So here you have Hamilton, Madison, John Jay, Federalist Papers, and the Bill of Rights. Remember the amendments, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. All right, so framing a new government continued. You have also the Judiciary Act of 1789, which created a Supreme Court with one Chief Justice and 5 associate justices. That also led to the creation of executive departments, state, treasury, and war. And this is kind of the unwritten part of the Constitution, where the president could appoint heads, leaders of these departments to form his cabinet. All right. So they would be appointed by the president and Senate approval. But nowhere in the Constitution does it say that. It's just done matter-of-factly. So Secretary of State went to Thomas Jefferson. Secretary of Treasury went to I am Alexander Hamilton, and Secretary of War went to Henry Knox. So throughout Washington's first term, Jefferson and Hamilton are going to battle over the role of the government and philosophy of how a government should run. So Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, Henry, I got a double chin, triple chin, Knox. So Federalists and Republicans. So again, nowhere in the Constitution does it say political parties can be formed, blah, 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 but they are. And you have the first political party, and that would be strongly led by Alexander Hamilton. You could say George Washington was a part of it. They favor, obviously, a strong central government. They're also the Federalist political party and the Federalists kind of are similar, but one's a political party and one were people trying to gain support for the ratification of the Constitution because they wanted it to happen fast. And they are supported by the wealthy and the merchants. You'll see kind of a divide in an area where these people come from. You have Alexander Hamilton's financial plan. If you've seen Hamilton on Netflix, you know this, or you've heard it be sung. So the federal government would assume states' debts because remember, each state kind of ran like their own country. Federal government would also pay off debt at full face value, funding at par, meaning they would also pay interest. Nice. And then Alexander Hamilton's baby is the creation of the Bank of the United States, BUS, Bank of the United States. So Hamilton loosely interpreted the Constitution. So you get these strict interpretations and loose interpretations, and that's where the wording of the Constitution comes to play, where strict constitutionalists, strict constructionists, whatever you want to call it, they read and interpret the Constitution as it is written, and others, loose interpretationists, loose constructionists, read it as, well, this is how I interpret it. And so he's going to refer to the elastic clause and push for this Bank of the United States. There's also, he proposes an excise tax, which is a tax on manufactured goods, and we'll get to that later because there's an example. Also a tariff, passing tariffs to help homegrown businesses in America by taxing imported goods. And the opposite was, I said Hamilton and Jefferson would go at it. So Jefferson and his supporters, called the Democrat Republicans or Republicans, agreed to the plan when the capital was moved to the South, because it used to be, I think it was in Philadelphia, and they moved the capital to be in Southern Territory, which was then Maryland. It is today Maryland and Chesapeake region. For those, remember, Chesapeake region is kind of in the South. All right, so they moved it to the South. So they agreed to Hamilton's plan because the capital was in now Southern Territory, closer to home. All right, so here you have an excise tax. Uncle Sam, and this is the Bank of the United States. So Federalists and Republicans continued. Republican Party, Democrat Republicans, or Jeffersonians, because they're the party of Jefferson. These are totally different than the Democrats and Republicans of today. Don't get it twisted. Led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. It is good to note James Madison helped write the Federalist Papers with Alexander Hamilton, but those two had, conflicting ideologies, and hey, James Madison switched his sides. They believed farmers were the backbone of the economy, and they were also pro-French. Why? Because the French helped us during the Revolutionary War. So this is around the time of the French Revolution, world history. You should know this, 1789. And Republicans supported the revolution, and they were for the dismantlement of the monarchy. Federalists were horrified by the horror of the revolution, as we know later on during the Reign of Terror. Who did that? If you said Robespierre, you were correct. Remember, Jacobin. Here's Jefferson, and here's an execution in France. All right, so establishing national sovereignty. So now what? What can the federal government do? And these examples kind of exhibit what the federal government's powers were. So you have the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794. It was in response to the excise tax on whiskey. So people manufacturing whiskey at home now had to pay another tax in order to sell it. They're not going to like it. Washington is going to summon state militias. That's because the Constitution said that states are going to need a militia to send soldiers, and the rebellion was quickly stopped. So in contrast to the Articles and the Constitution, the Articles didn't really call for a national standing army, national state militias. So when Shays' Rebellion happened, Shays kind of got away with it longer than this Whiskey Rebellion. And so that demonstrated this idea of the new government has some power, people. Also, Native Americans were not granted citizenship under the Constitution, and they were not considered foreign nations as European countries were considered to these Americans, and that's just bad luck. I'm saying that's just bad. That's just bad. And there's no direct representation in government. And yeah, I this is sad. It's sad to mention. Okay, and sorry guys. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Native Americans. I'm sorry. Our forefathers didn't understand you. Establishing national sovereignty again. U.S. neutrality. So Washington is going to urge neutrality in the war between France and Britain because this is during the time of Napoleon. And, you know, France and Britain are like forever enemies, frenemies, I guess, four enemies, I guess you could say. And then you have Citizen Genet, and this is a French diplomat that urged Americans to go to war against Britain because, you know, basically half the country supports the French Revolution. The French supported us during our revolution. We should go against Britain. And then you have something called Jay's Treaty. Our guy, John Jay, is the first Supreme Court justice. And the U.S. is going to make a treaty with Britain. Because the British were hijacking some of our ships as we were trading with the rest of Europe. And the U.S. will receive compensation for the damaged ships, and that's going to upset the South because they also lost, goods that they were sending to Europe. And Britain promised to leave their posts, aka forts, like they said they were going to do in the Treaty of Paris at the end of the war. They did not. So again, they're trying to get the British from their forts out of the country. You also have the Pinckney's Treaty, which is a treaty with Spain. As the U.S. was granted, Spain kind of owns the Louisiana Purchase right at this time. And so the U.S. was granted navigation rights on the Mississippi River and the idea of right of deposit in New Orleans so they could store and trade goods in New Orleans, and they could store them there. Deposit, like you go to a bank, you make a deposit, it stays there. So it's kind of like what are those? A storage garage, or garage storage, whatever. So that's kind of what they were granted rights. And New Orleans is a big port in the Gulf of Mexico. So Citizen Genet, and here you have a political cartoon of dummies of John Jay. Say this is Jay, and they're burning this dummy because Southerners are upset with him. So downfall of the Federalist election in 1796. Back in the day, two candidates were chosen. The first candidate would become president. The second candidate would become the vice president. And it's not until later that that gets fixed. But can you imagine going up, Biden going up against Trump and Trump or Biden becoming the vice president? That would be awkward. It would be awkward, right? So, election 1796, John Adams becomes president. Jefferson is his vice president. Adams is of the party of the Federalists. In Washington's farewell address, it was published well known. We might take a look at this. And he warned against foreign alliances. So you have the XYZ affair, where 3 U.S. diplomats were sent to France, and they come across 3 French diplomats named X, Y, and Z, and they demanded a bribe to, what was it? I think it was like $250,000, and you will fight the French, or you will fight the British. And back home in America, war hysteria ensues. And so you have this quasi-war, which was basically an undeclared naval war between the U.S. and France. And this kind of ends with Napoleon's reign, as Napoleon was focusing more on European domination, and he did not care about what was going on at sea. So Washington's address. All right, so the downfall. You have the Alien and Sedition Act, 1798. The purpose was to punish the opposition to the Federalist Party and to the Adams administration because people were saying mean and nasty things. So you have the Alien Act, which increased residency requirements for foreigners to become citizens, and the president could deport foreigners as they wished. Excuse me. And you have the Sedition Act. There are 2 separate acts, but they're kind of grouped together. And sedition is basically the making it illegal to criticize the government. You couldn't do that, all right? And 10 Republican newspaper editors were convicted under this law because they were criticizing the government, and they were arrested and put in jail. You also have the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions written by Jefferson and Madison. Jefferson wrote the Kentucky resolution, and Madison wrote the Virginia resolution. And they're urging the states to nullify the Alien and Sedition Acts, making them null and void. They don't apply to our state. That's going to come up again, nullification. And it was more symbolic at the time, trying to garner these new states and their legislatures to pass these and make them null and void in their state. Again, Jefferson and Madison. The downfall, Revolution of 1800 is against Adams and Jefferson in the election of 1800, and it's kind of called a revolution. Jefferson and Burr tied for the presidency, and it's a very close margin. Aaron Burr, sir. And Thomas Jefferson eventually wins the tie-off, count-off, vote-off, if you want to call it. Burr becomes his vice president. Why is it called the revolution? It was a peaceful transition of power between political parties. You also have the Judiciary Act of 1801, which was passed by Congress while Adams was still president. It created new federal judgeships, and Adams appointed many in his last days of office. And this is kind of typical of modern presidents to this day. And back then they were called midnight judges, and there was a showdown to come forth thanks to Adams, even though Jefferson would become president very soon. Jefferson versus Adams, there can only be one. And this is the Supreme Court, John Marshall. All right, so some past essay topics that showed up on the APUSH exam in regards to this chapter. Analyze the reasons for the Federalists' opposition to ratifying the Constitution, the Anti-Federalists' opposition to ratifying the Constitution, That was a free response. So hopefully you have some idea of what that would be. If you want to practice these at home, that's good for you. And to what extent was the United States Constitution a radical departure from the Articles of Confederation? That showed up on the Form B free response 2005. So, some very, very good topic, very good ideas. So, yeah, that concludes the end of the chapter. I know it was kind of a long one. Sorry about it. It's a very important one. And this idea of the Constitution being created to this the central government exercising their actual federal power, as well as the transfer of power from Washington and Adams, the Federalists, to the new political party, Democrat Republicans, or Jeffersonians, because Thomas Jefferson. All right, so hopefully you liked that. If you did, smash that like button. And as always, stay safe, wash your hands. Peace.